We're wrapping up our lecture series on the theory of evolution, and the last stop on the way is to discuss some of the quandaries of speciation. So previously we had talked about how evolutionists might speculate the speciation of the chordata had occurred and all the different diverging branches and those various selection pressures that may have driven them. But oftentimes what's left out is a discussion of how we even got to the first body plans. It's one thing for an animal to undergo some changes. It's another thing entirely for an animal to come to be in the first place. You know, the basic building blocks, so to speak. Where did those come from? So that's a little bit of what we're talking about here. Somebody who is a proponent for the theory that life came to be spontaneously and that it was unguided, and that there is no divine intentionality or creative act in it. These are some of the things that they would require in their worldview. There would have to be raw ingredients that come to be, that can be used to make life. And so those come from the raw elements, just literally nitrogen, helium, hydrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, all of those types of elements. So the first question would be, where did they come from? And one of the answers that is speculated is that they were brought by stardust or meteorites, and that it was meteorites crashing, possibly, that would have brought some of the carbon to our planet, and in fact some of the energy from those collisions may have arranged some simple amino acids. There's actually a few studies where people will crash things together to see if they can create some amino acids, and those studies have yielded variable results. Okay, another big one is that there would have to be a reducing environment. What this means is that there can be absolutely no oxygen. Oxygen is an electronegative atom, which means it likes to strip off electrons from things. It pulls on electrons. And so generally if there's oxygen around and things are oxidizing, it makes it so that things break down rather than build up. A reducing environment would be one that was rich in nitrogen, methane, and possibly water vapor. And that would be the type of environment that would need to be, that would be the type of atmosphere that would need to occur in order for, in theory, any type of molecule to gain any sort of scale so that it could be a larger macromolecule. There's a famous experiment here called the Miller and Urey experiment where they tried to demonstrate making organic molecules from some of these original ingredients, so ammonia and methane and hydrogen and water, and they basically put them all in and shocked them, see what they could get. And it's reported that they were able to retrieve some amino acids, some very simple amino acids from this experiment. Okay, another thing is that because there's no oxygen in this type of earlier environment, there then is no ozone. Ozone is O3. And so without oxygen in the atmosphere, you don't get any ozone. So there would be very harsh ultraviolet radiation beating down from the sun. It would probably fry any macromolecule that was able to somehow arrange itself. So it's thought that maybe that some of the first molecules would have had to have been built in something under shelter, under rock ledges, or maybe at the bottom of some seas. And then another big one is that there must be clay particles. So one of the big caveats here is that monomers to large molecules often are charged particles or charged molecules, and oftentimes charged molecules don't want to come together. So there, for example, would be a bunch of nucleotides to make a nucleic acid. Nucleotides all have a slight negative charge on them because of the phosphate group. And negative charges don't want to come near one another. They repel each other. So the thought then is that maybe there was some clay particles that had a positive charge on them, and that drew all of the individual monomers together so that they could then bind. Now, another caveat here is that water generally wants to break molecules down. This is called hydrolysis, and it happens naturally in our cells. Enzymes make the breakdown of molecules happen faster, but just hydrolysis will act to break them down as well. That's another tricky part of this. So you have hydrolysis working against the creation of macromolecules. You have also the fact that they have similar charges and want to repel each other, working against the formation of large macromolecules. But in theory, the clay particles would have helped to alleviate some of that burden, some of that barrier. Okay, another one is that there would have to be an RNA world. This is the famous chicken and egg scenario, because you have DNA, and DNA is used to make protein, but at the same time, protein is used to make DNA, right? So, which one came first? If we have a world where there's no protein, then there isn't the equipment required to replicate DNA. If we have a world where there's protein and no DNA, then there isn't anything that can be used to build more protein later on. And it seems unlikely that a huge molecule like DNA and a huge molecule like a protein, some sort of enzyme, would simultaneously come together on the same clay particle, building each other, and they would happen to be the right lock and key fit where the proteins helped to build the DNA, and then it all got wrapped in a membrane all in one swoop so that it couldn't be destroyed by the UV radiation or the water. It's very difficult to explain that. So the theory then is that it wasn't DNA or protein that was first, it was RNA, because RNA is a genetic, or RNA is a nucleic acid similar to DNA, and it also does have some enzymatic activity, so it can behave somewhat like proteins can. So the thought there is that there was first the creation of these things that were similar to modern day ribozymes, they're called, which are basically just pieces of RNA that act something like an enzyme. All right, and then lastly, the macromolecules would have to have been enclosed by a membrane. It's the plasma membrane that helps to separate the internal environment of the cell from the external environment surrounding it. Without a membrane, there is no selective permeability, and so it's impossible to maintain a constant internal environment, which is something that's necessary for all living things. Okay, now when we get to the early Earth, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and this is admitted by probably most. This is from a biology textbook, an undergraduate biology textbook, where they're basically saying by no means are any of these things certain. There's a lot of diversity of assumptions and experiments and contradictory hypotheses. So I think it's important just to keep that in mind. Okay? That if in theory we're able to discuss a pathway of speciation that somewhat makes sense, it's always going to be hitched to origins of the Earth speculations, which are very murky at best, if one is someone who doesn't just trust it all to the divine power of a creator. Okay, so assuming that we somehow were able to have macromolecules originate on the primordial seas of the ancient Earth, here's how some of the progression of prokaryotic evolution would have to look like. So remember that this is an environment that it has nitrogen, methane, and water vapor. There's no oxygen in the atmosphere. Well, the first organisms would probably have obtained energy by just absorbing the organic molecules from the primordial seas. So they would have taken nitrogen, probably some kind of ammonia type molecule, or they maybe would have taken hydrogen sulfide and used those to make energy. And there are organisms that can do that today, so it's not entirely far-fetched to think that. But the question would be then, if they were happy making energy, just taking these molecules from the water. I mean, that's a pretty good life. There's no competition. There's probably plenty of these types of elements in the water. Then what would be the pressure to evolve, right? You always have to consider the selection pressure that would encourage evolution of an organism if you're an evolutionist. So the thought then is that eventually some of the organic molecules would get used up, and so then as a workaround, it would select and encourage the evolution of photosynthetic organisms. Although again, there is no oxygen that can be made here at this point, because oxygen will just again start to destroy stuff. So it's thought that the first were anaerobic photosynthetic organisms, meaning they took hydrogen sulfide as their source of electrons and not water. Most plants that are aerobic photosynthetic organisms, remember, will take water and they'll split it apart, and it will yield oxygen, hydrogen ions, and then also electrons. They send the electrons through the electron transport chain. It creates a proton gradient, which flows through the ATP synthase to make ATP. And then oxygen is a byproduct. Well, in this type of situation, the hydrogen sulfide provides, the sulfur provides the electrons, and the electrons actually just keep going round and round and round. They don't have to be replenished, so there is no creation of oxygen. Okay, after a while then, all the hydrogen sulfide would be used up, and so that would spur on the evolution of aerobic photosynthetic organisms, and those would be similar to our modern day cyanobacteria. And these organisms would take water and they'd split it apart to make oxygen. Now, initially all of the oxygen that was made, it's thought, would have been absorbed by the iron and earth crust, creating rust. So even though oxygen was being produced, it wasn't being accumulated to any severe degree such that it would cause the oxidation and the destruction of all the living things and the macromolecules and all that stuff. Okay, as soon as it accumulates in the atmosphere, it would pretty much destroy nearly all the organisms, but perhaps there would be a few that survived that were then well suited to be aerobic organisms. And so these would be the ones that then are able to have membrane enclosed organelles like mitochondria, and the mitochondria can take that oxygen and they can break it apart to make energy, and then now we have more stable organisms. Oxygen is now on the scene, and there are organisms that are adapted to it, so it's no longer devastating to those organisms, and then they can proliferate, and now we have a whole new lineage of organisms that are able to survive in an oxygen-rich environment, and again, they would flourish because the whole world would be at their doorstep. There wouldn't be any other competition at that point. They would just be making, they'd be using all of the oxygen that's being made and thriving. Okay, now it's thought that the first eukaryotic cells were cells that had developed a partnership with some of the first bacteria. So here we're seeing it's called the proto-eukaryote would have been a cell that had a nucleus in it and some membrane-bound organelles. And it's thought that at some point an aerobic bacterium found its way into that cell and later produced a lineage of cells that all had that aerobic bacterium still in it, and it eventually gave rise to the modern eukaryote with its mitochondrion. And then similarly, later on, that's a group of cells, a photosynthetic bacterium made its way in, and then that gave rise to some of the modern photosynthetic eukaryotes, and that became more of like the chloroplast structure with time. Now there is a couple of pieces of evidence that people will point out here for this theory. One is that mitochondria do divide independently, and they do have their own circular DNA chromosome, but there are a few genes on the nucleus that govern how mitochondria behave and interact with mitochondria. So then it's thought that the genes that are not in the mitochondria were transferred over to the nucleus at some point in time. Okay, chloroplasts, similar thing. They divide on their own. They have a circular DNA chromosome, so on and so forth. All right, so then let's imagine that there are now prokaryotes flourishing in this early environment. They would eventually given rise to multicellular organisms. The selection pressure there is that it's advantageous to be large, because if you're larger, there's more stability, there's more ability to store nutrients and things. So that's, in theory, what people speculate is the selection pressure to drive the evolution of multicellular organisms. It's thought that some of the first multicellular organisms were algae. An example is here. This is considered to be a fossil of an algae known as Grapania spiralis. These little squiggly dudes. And from here, it's thought that simple marine invertebrates would have evolved. The simplest of the invertebrates are the sponges and the sea jellies, the jellyfish. Now, there aren't really many fossils here of multicellular organisms, and there's also not very fossils here either. When we get further along the line in some of the earlier Precambrian rock layers, just leading up to, or the rock layers leading just up to the Cambrian period, there are some strange invertebrates, but there are also not many clear fossils here, and the ones that are found here are also not found in the subsequent layers. And then from here, we explode into all major animal phyla that pretty much exist today. Okay, so this is a little bit of a perplexing quandary, and then from here we come to land plants and insects. So this is a pretty perplexing quandary because you have this huge gap that doesn't really have strong traces in the fossil record. There's mostly missing transitional links here in this journey from some of the theoretically first algae to the actual major animal phyla that are still in existence today. I wanted to wrap everything up with just a summary of some of my thoughts on the whole topic. None of this is going to be on the exam, so you don't have to watch any further if you're not interested. And then furthermore, this is all very speculative stuff. I'm not an expert in any of this kind of stuff. This is just some of the things that some of the observations I've taken, which have informed my own personal belief. The first one I can't get over is just the fossil record. I would suspect that if the Earth really was young, and if there really was a global flood that created the entire Grand Canyon, that there would be such a mismatch of fossils in different layers. There would be mammal artifacts here. There'd be like skulls and things down here. We would see some kind of dinosaur bone or something. And from how it appears, it doesn't seem like any such fossil of that type of a more complicated organism, like a reptile or amphibian or mammal. There's nothing like that found down here. So I find that to be evidence that lends credence to the theory of evolution. But I'm still hoping. I'm still hoping one day we find the big dinosaur fossil down here, and the whole entire popular sentiment over the last 50 years is debunked and unraveled in an instant. Okay, it could happen, maybe. Another perplexing thing about a global flood is the fact that there are animal tracks found in the Coconino sandstone, and there are some animal tracks, I think, found right here by the Hermit Shale. And that's very difficult for me to reconcile with a global flood. If this is just a sequence of layers stacking on top of one another as the sediment deposits, and it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on, it seems very strange that there would be a time where things would be calm enough and there would be land animals that could get down here and walk around on here and then have it be solidified as for all of time for everyone to see. That seems very unlikely in a tumultuous flood-like environment. You know, I would think that if this was a global flood, by the time we get up here, I mean, anything that's still on land is long gone, right? Anything not on that boat is toast, unless it's a water animal. But I mean, tracks like this don't seem to be the type of tracks that could be made by an aquatic animal, unless, I don't know, maybe it was like a turtle or something. I'm not sure. But this would also have to be not super rapidly deposited either. Things would have to be settling down at this point for tracks to be made. Now, to be fair, people would say that the Coconino sandstone is deposited by air, basically wind blowing sand around and causing sand drifts. And that's hard to understand how tracks could be made in that layer under those conditions as well, because generally fossils require there to be moisture. It requires there to be some sort of mud or some kind of material that will keep the shape, right? If sand's just dry and blowing, I mean, dry blowing sand doesn't, you go step on the Sahara Desert, it's not going to leave a track. It's going to be blown away right away, right? So so there must have been some moisture here. So that's another interesting thing to consider. Okay, on the flip side then, though, when I look at the Grand Canyon, I mean, look at just how sheer these valleys are. I mean, this is extensive erosion of material. It's really hard for me to believe that this was the result of a river, especially when you compare some of the other rivers around. The case would be made that the reason why the Grand Canyon is so stark is that it's so dry, and so the rainwater didn't have a chance to clear cut all of this stuff that remains. So most other river basins, everything has been eroded away, so that's why you don't see these structures. But there are other places where there's dry riverbeds, like the Nile is very dry, and a good portion of the Yellow River is very dry, and yet we still don't see some of these formations. So that's one thing that I find very hard to believe, that all this was created just by the slow tricklings of a river. Furthermore, I mean, that's just the start of it, okay? This is the Grand Canyon. So when you look at a picture like this, what you're seeing here, that's only this. This keeps going on for the further north you go. So this thing goes way, way, way up. And all of this material, you're telling me, was carved by a river? That's just really hard for me to believe, okay? And I get really hung up on this. I cannot understand how people believe that these layers were deposited slowly over time, right? I mean, just think about all of this activity that's happening right now on our planet. We should see all sorts. We should not see flat layers that span across great lengths. You know, especially they continue going further north you go. They're all pretty well flat. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense. We should see things looking a lot more like this. We should see big pits in there and valleys throughout the years. We should see gradual changes from sand to limestone and showing banks and beaches, and we should see sand dunes. And like, this should not be nice flat layers like this that are discrete, all being of a certain nature, and then whoop, switches, all being of a different nature, then switches, whoop, all being of a different nature, then switches. That to me does not, it's hard for me to believe that, it's hard for me to see why people think that that is gradual changes over time. That looks very much like quantum, more rapid sedimentation. For example, when you take a jar of dirt and you shake it up, I mean, it separates out and it looks like this. You have the stones, and then you have the coarse sand, then you have the finer sand, and then you have the smaller particles, the silt, and then the smallest particles would be the clay particles. And they would be suspended in solution, and then at the very top would be some of the animal and plant remains, the things that have oils in them and the things that maybe still have oxygen in them, and so they're floating. And then over time, these would become waterlogged and they would sink, and then all of the clay particles would settle out to form another layer here. And when you look at the Grand Canyon, you almost start to see this sequence of events. You see some sandstone here, and then on top of that, so that would be like here, and then on top of that, all of the clay particles, as far as I can understand, and you know, somebody would have to correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not a geologist, but from what I understand, shale is made out of finer, silty type clay particles. And then let's imagine that that was one flood event. And now we have seas that are right here. The sea level is right here. And we've got aquatic organisms living in that sea and dying and decaying and creating this sediment of limestone. Limestone's made out of it's differentiated by sandstone in that it has calcium carbonate in it. Calcium carbonate is a molecule that's made in living things. Basically, it's made in like a lot of shells from clams and other mollusks. That's made of calcium carbonate. There's calcium carbonate in our bones. So this, let's imagine then that this is the sea, and then there's living things that are dying and being deposited, and so it's causing this little ripple effect here. And then let's imagine there's another flood event that raises the sea level even higher, and so we've got a whole nother thing where all of these different types of particles are scattered throughout, creating layers of sandstone. And then we've got the shale again that's formed, and then now the waters are right here, and so we have amphibians coming in, and they're, you know, living in this clay-like material, and they're leaving their imprints. And then we have another event where the waters rise a little bit, and so we've got well, on top of this bed of clay over the years, then there's sand that's deposited in here. So this is kind of like a sandy seashore, and maybe it's shallow enough where some of those shallow enough seas where some animals can walk on here. And then it does leave tracks as the waters recede or come up, or recede or come up. You know, there has to be water here for the tracks to be solidified. And so then maybe there's a moment where the water is just above here and it's creating a nice sandy beach type environment, and then the water recedes and it leaves those tracks in place. And because it's so dry, it dries quite fast and gets covered with more sand, and then it's preserved. And then we have another flood event which does the same cycle. that's a little bit more what it looks like to me. Okay, it looks like not one global flood. It looks to me like a series of floods. And we know that over the course of history, there's been cyclic changes. So imagine, just entertain the idea. This is kind of my working theory here, and it's by no means bulletproof. But one of the things I've been thinking of is when you look at the topographic map of the world, this is how it looks. There's higher elevations right here, and there's higher elevations right here. So if we translate that to how continents would have looked when they were arranged in something like a supercontinent, there would be higher elevations forming a border here, and there'd be higher elevations forming a border here. And then let's imagine that this is full of ice. This whole thing is completely covered with ice. Okay, and let's imagine that we have very shallow seas, and the ice is pretty much locking all of the continents together. Well, let's say that through one of those cyclic changes, a whole bunch of the ice melts, and so it pours down the sides, it fills the seas full, it scoops up all the sediment from the terrestrial regions that are exposed here, and it basically forms a whole bunch of waves in tumultuous conditions. Those waves come crashing along the higher elevations of the coast, and with that they deposit all of those layers. They deposit the sand and then the shale. And then now the elevation of water has risen, so there's actually an aquatic environment along the coast here, which is causing the limestone regions to be made on top of the shale. And then so many years pass, and then it happens again, and so now more ice has receded, and the waters again have risen, and the same thing happens. It scoops up all of it causes tumultuous conditions here, and it comes crashing against the coast, and then it deposits it all again, a second event. So then the same sequence, you've got some of the sandstone, and then the shale being made, and then now you've got a higher sea, and you've got some sand on top of it forming the coconino sandstone. And then now there's a spot here for terrestrial organisms to reside, and there's also a spot here for civilizations to thrive. So you've got God creating Adam and Eve now, somewhere around, it'd be somewhere around in here. It's hard to figure out where modern day Mesopotamia would be, but it would be somewhere in this region here. And now that civilization is underway, and this is where Genesis takes off, and Adam and Eve are made, and then from there, the Genesis account is historically accurate. It's just that there were millions and millions of maybe years prior to that event in which animals were evolving by the hand of God, and then eventually when the form of one particular animal is how God likes it, then he breathes life into that form and creates the first human, Adam and Eve. Now this does lock you into a philosophy where there were organisms dying before the fall, but one thing maybe a counterpoint I would argue is that if there is no conscious awareness of the death, is it really considered death? So if in theory, if Adam and Eve, God breathed life into some forms of animals that he had created through the process of evolution here, and this happened 6,000 years ago, there was never a conscious awareness of death. And so is it then really technically considered death in terms of our understanding of it or our context? It's kind of an interesting point there. So then God breathes life into Adam and Eve. They're the first humans. This is 6,000 years ago. And then what happens is the big flood, the flood. And I think maybe what happened is that, let's imagine there was some volcano eruption that hit an oil fields in one of these seas somewhere. That would basically cause somewhere off in the distance, it would cause a massive evaporation of the seas. You would have all this water that's been pooling from the ice caps now uh, basically being boiled off in some remote part of the earth, and that would be then putting water into the atmosphere. That would cause a lot of rain. Okay, if you're boiling the ocean and putting that vapor into the atmosphere, that would cause a lot of rain. And so at this point then, it starts raining like crazy. The rain pours down on the remaining ice caps, and now we've got the flood, the Genesis flood. And so there's a huge pool of water that forms here. And if you think about the main outlets for that pool of water to get out, it would be the Colorado River. It would be also the Yellow River right here. And then I don't know of any other rivers that come through across on the outlets here, but if you imagine this being a huge pool, I mean, and there's one little outlet here and one little out here, water would rip through that outlet. It would probably spill over the sides everywhere, but in addition, the amount of water that's leaving would probably be not as great as the amount of water coming if it's raining. And so then the water is it's pouring over the sides of the mountain ranges, but it's also just ripping through the Colorado River Valley, and that would be the type of force I think required to carve out this type of amount of material. And as the water's flowing over the edges of the Rocky Mountains, it's depositing all these layers laterally, which is something that does happen. And it's just ripping through here. Okay, now the ark lands somewhere here, and now there's no more ice trapping this continent together. And you can imagine that if we had that combination of events, like a boiling event where the evaporated the water, the seas into water vapor, and then now the ice caps are free and this is no longer locked together through ice, you could imagine that these would start to then separate out pretty quick, because now they're floating in a way. I don't know if these plates float, but there's, if there's all the ice that was here is now water, I mean, you can imagine that would change the buoyancy drastically of these bodies of land. So then Noah lands, the animals migrate away, and then after that, the continents then are now moving away from one another at a much more rapid pace, because they're now free from the ice which has bound them. And there's also much more fluid on the earth. I don't know where that fluid went. It went into the atmosphere, and then it maybe went down into some deep crevices way underneath the surface of the earth. That's the part I don't quite really have figured out. But then the animals are able to get around to the different continents. This is the reason why you have those same species found throughout, and those species have not undergone speciation, like the flowering plant that we mentioned earlier, that they spread out actually much more recently, like only 6,000 years or 4,000 years ago. And then once these had migrated, then now they've kind of settled out and they've found their relative positions, so the migration of the plates is much slower than it used to be. This also helps explain, like in the Bible when it talks about the four, corners of the earth. I mean, this is kind of more of a flat earth, so to speak, when you have all these masses here put together. So it's an interesting theory, I think. It does, I think, describe the deposition of the layers. It also describes why we don't really see a whole bunch of mixing of fossils. It lends credence partially to the idea of evolution, but it also fits nicely with a biblical account, a biblical narrative, historical narrative of the book of Genesis, starting with humans 6,000 years ago. You have to stretch your mind a little bit for the 6-day creation event. And remember, we talked about how in time dilation, that time ultimately is relative. And so whether we're going the speed of light, time moves infinitely slower. Whether we are not moving the speed of light, it moves much more fast. So in God's perspective, I think 6 days could mean anything. And we're not really the ones to be able to, that should have to judge God's standard of time according to our own standard or thoughts of time. And this type of theory also does require believing that evolution was one of the mechanisms that God used to create. But I don't necessarily think that that is a big caveat, theologically speaking, if we still do have God breathing his life into two unique forms, which are then the very two first humans. I struggle with the idea of, one of the struggles with the idea of evolution is the idea that consciousness evolved, and so now you've got, eons of years where there's these semi-conscious individuals that didn't have the breath of God in them. I don't like that view. Makes me feel uncomfortable a little bit. But I do like the idea of all of these animals evolving by the power of God and the laws of physics and the conditions that he had ordained. And then once the framework is where he wants it, then associates consciousness to two of those forms, and they become the two first people. And that was an event that happened very recent, only about 6,000 years ago. This also explains then why language and written language and traces of civilization are very recent, only several thousand years old, BC, fitting very nicely with the timeline portrayed in the Bible. Okay, so that's my short analysis, and I welcome more conversation about this. If you have any theological objections that I haven't really considered, or if you have some other insights which would make it more plausible that this whole event was one global flood, please run it by me. It's an interesting topic, and I do enjoy thinking a lot about it. I don't necessarily know if it's really something that we were ever meant to completely figure out. I think if God wanted to make it clear, he would have definitely stuck some dinosaurs at some point down in these layers, because that would be conclusive evidence that the whole theory of evolution is totally ridiculous. But so far that hasn't been the case. So I think it was God's intention to keep it uncertain, so to speak, and that would require us to maintain some humility. It would require us not to be too dogmatic and quick to judge, because when we do that, we're kind of almost proclaiming ourselves to be on par with God, right? We're proclaiming that we are the ones with the divine knowledge, so to speak. And I think it was always only intended that God would be the one that holds that knowledge, and that we can just have relationship with him. We can find humility in ourselves, and we can trust that he is the one that's in control, and let the way that he works be somewhat of an awe-inspiring mystery, a mystery that we can put our hope in will be solved when we meet him face to face, right? So that would be my encouragement to you, is to not get too hung up on feeling like you have to solve all the mysteries here. I think God intended them to be mysterious, and continue to walk in relationship with him until you meet him face to face, and he can tell you all about how it worked. All right, that's all I've got for you, and I hope you've enjoyed this survey of the topic of evolution.